everybody. My name is Declan O'Brien, Program Coordinator for the Elections and Democracy Program at the Kofi and Annan Foundation. And on behalf of the Foundation and our friends at the Inter-Parliamentary Union, I'd like to welcome you all and all of our panelists to this discussion today. Both the Foundation and IPU have been working to support young people who want to be involved in politics and decision-making in their own communities. We want to do more, and we want young people to let us know what would be the most valuable and useful actions. Geneva Peace Week provides a great opportunity to bring people together to look at the ways in which young people are becoming involved in social or political movements, and also how to harness that energy and potential. And frankly, I want to move straight into getting their views on how politicians, how political parties, how social media companies, and others can be more responsive to young people. Hopefully, over the course of our discussion today, we can identify some initial steps or ideas that the Foundation, IPU, and others in the democracy support community can build on. First, we have the distinct pleasure to be joined by Ms. Emma Theofelus, Member of Parliament and Namibia's Deputy Minister of Information and Communication Technology. We also have Samson Itodo, who is the Executive Director of Yaga Africa and the convener of the Not Too Young to Run movement that resulted in a reduction of age limits for running for public office in Nigeria. We also have Victoria Nruche, who's with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and she's been working with us at the Foundation to research the youth social media intersection and its impact on democracy. I'm going to first turn to Emma to get us started. So Emma, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the role social media played in your story, how it engages other young people in formal politics in Namibia. Is it really seen as a force for good? And perhaps as a member of government now, what priorities do you see for getting more young people involved in politics?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, at this point in time, we have just even recently had a discussion with the First Lady's office around social media and its impact on politics and dialogue and discussion in the country. The role young people are playing on social media is really to invite politicians, public institutions, policymakers on the platform that they're more comfortable with, a platform they can say what they want to say without any limitations, and to create really an honest and authentic conversation around issues around the country. So social media has been received positively around that aspect. But of course, there's also the concern of it being abused to, tarnish people's names by either painting a certain picture about them or not having any consequences to what they're saying, no matter how harmful it is. So it's really like a sort of a double-edged sword. Social media's interactions between politicians and young people. But the impact social media has had on my work has been tremendous. I recall when we announced the state of emergency in March, when COVID-19 hit on American shores mid-March, when President Hage Geingob announced the state of emergency, really everyone started working from home. The lockdown was effected, and it was really up to social networks for people to communicate, be in touch, and more importantly, for me as a representative in the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology to communicate information about COVID-19. And my biggest allies were young people on social media who would share the information, who would repackage it for those who are in their immediate surroundings, whether it's in their households or their communities. So really that came in very handy to share information almost instantly about happenings around COVID-19, understanding what it's all about and how one can actually do their part to ensure they protect themselves from it. So really from that perspective, social media was able to assist me and the work that we're doing in ensuring that information is communicated. And lastly, whether or not social media played a role in the decision-making way of formally getting into politics, I think a lot of conversations start on social media, especially in a country like Namibia, where 60% of the population is actually young people. Most of their views are communicated on social media. So really the interest in connecting with other young people who share similar sentiments was a great way to learn and unlearn ways on how to better deal with policies or deal with policymakers or implementation thereof. So really, it didn't contribute that much to me joining formal politics, but it did become a catalyst for me to be able to continuously engage with groups of people that I engaged before I got into politics, to tap into their knowledge, to tap into their ideas, but also continually keep on connected. They're able to guide the work that I'm doing currently as a deputy minister and a member of parliament in Namibia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of really interesting points there to follow up on, particularly these questions around COVID and disinformation, which I think obviously has had a huge impact over the last 6 or 8 months or so. And maybe we can come back to that. But perhaps I could just ask you a quick follow-up question, Emma, which is on this question of young people are using social media to get involved in political movements and in politics. Are political parties using social media as well to try and engage young people, or is it kind of just a one-way street at the moment?
Well, at the moment, it's still not as engaging as it should be. I mean, many political parties are online on social platforms, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. They constantly feed information about whether it's activities that they are planning to do, policies they'd like to communicate around, whether it's women issues, entrepreneurship, young people's issues, but it hasn't gotten to a point where it's really an engagement that's back and forth, that is meaningful and authentic and could actually translate into something happening offline. So that step we have not reached yet, but I think considering that many have only gotten onto social platforms now, I think it's a positive start.
Great, thanks. Well, as I said, we'll come back to some of that. But before we do, can I move on to Samson quickly? Samson, you have a huge amount of experience in terms of mobilizing young people, whether or not it's around a political issue or a social issue. How have you used social media as a tool to do that? And particularly perhaps around an electoral process, how have you used social media or internet tools to get young people out and engaged in around an election? And particularly, what role did it play in the You're Never Too Young to Lead campaign?
Well, thank you very much. It's Not Too Young to Run campaign. I think social media is a very, very powerful tool that we've used at YIGA Africa to one, get young people interested in electoral politics. Because of the two-way stream of communication that it provides. You know, young people are angry. They want to vent. Young people are looking for spaces where they can contribute to national development. Young people are looking for spaces where they can speak and the government can hear them. And so we use social media to engage with young people in the electoral process. So in going to register to vote at elections, also furnishing them with the information that they need to get involved on election day. I'm also tied to that. It's also using several tools to watch over the electoral process, prevent all forms of election rigging or malpractices. So to a large extent, we've used social media, to aggregate, youth voices to deepen, the integrity of our elections. One of the greatest things that social media, has also done, particularly for young people, it's expanded the frontiers of political socialization. And so you see young people debating, political party manifestos as well as candidates, programs and proposals, and even hosting tweet meets and Facebook Live engagements with candidates who hitherto they wouldn't have been able to engage them, but for social media. And social media played a very strong role in the Not Too Young to Run campaign. We always say this, that the story of the Not Too Young to Run campaign is a story of people, power, and change. And young people changed their constitutions from the streets using their phones and by building a strong alliance with an older generation that cared about political inclusion. Because we saw young people, calling on their legislators online, asking them to vote yes for the legislation. And we're ready to punish any legislator who voted no. And so we saw young people actually use social media, to name and shame legislators who were anti-youth, who were anti-political inclusion. And that really helped in providing that traction that we needed to push the envelope on political inclusion in Nigeria.
I think the campaign is a very interesting example because social media can be used very effectively around, single issue causes or moments. And the campaign like the one that you co-founded and helped curate is incredibly, I think was incredibly impactful. And I'd ask, how do you take that sort of energy and that momentum and that engagement that happens around a single issue or a single moment and turn it into sustained engagement by young people? I mean, have you seen that, for example, that those who are involved in your campaign have stayed on, have remained as engaged around political issues, or have some of those who sort of use social media as a great tool at that point perhaps sort of stopped now?
A very fascinating question, I must say. And the truth is, we're still studying that phenomenon on how social media and the not so young children influence political behavior, of young people in the last general elections that we had. We saw an increase in the number of young candidates in the 2019 elections. In 2015, we had about 26% youth candidacy. In 2019, it moved to about 34% youth candidacy in the elections. And we also saw an increase in the number of young people who won elections. So today in Nigeria, the youth representation moved from 5.2% for the last general elections to about 6.6%. It is still very low and very, very poor. But did the movement and the campaign, did it lead to youth turnout at elections? Because that is where we are still really lacking. Because in the last presidential elections, although you had 51% of young people as registered voters, we still recorded over 34% of turnout. So young people are still not using the power in the numbers that they have, and translating it to influence political outcomes. You just have a few young people showing up at elections. And that is why, that convergence between offline and offline engagement is very, very critical. Have we had people stay on course post, signing of this bill into law? There are a few, but we're not where we want to be. And that is why there needs to be huge investment in political education for young people. We've got to get young people into political parties because that's where, those changes happen. And the parties themselves also need to disrupt their processes and make it more inclusive for women, for young people, for young persons with disability. But the lack of internal party democracy has really impacted on how young people perceive political parties. But I would say in the terms of political engagement or civic engagement and holding leaders to account, social media has really recorded and provided a huge opportunity for young people. And so we've seen other laws, like laws that foster gender rights or against or foster legislative action in the course of the COVID-19 with the Control of Infectious Diseases Bill, or we've seen anti-social media bills or hate speech bills, and how young people have organized using social media to kill certain anti-people legislations in the National Assembly. And for me, that is democracy at play, and that's the power that social media has if effectively used by young people.
And one question I do want to come back to at the end is how it can be used more effectively by the political parties and the political institutions, because I think in many cases it's not young people who lack that motivation and that desire to get involved. It's that, traditional political parties that can be, quite frankly, traditional and conservative, are not making the steps or taking the steps necessary to make sure that, they can meet young people in those spaces that you were referring to. But before we come back to that, let me turn now to Victoria, who's also Nigerian, but based here in Geneva. So Victoria, maybe you have some comments on the campaign that Samson was involved in. But also you've been looking at this, you've been looking at some research in terms of how Kenyan and Nigerian young people use social media around their recent elections. I mean, do your findings tally with what you've heard from the others today?
Yes, my findings do tally. From our research, we discovered that social media at its best has provided a platform for many to voice their thoughts and opinions, to engage like-minded people and form collectives to mobilize for change. But as well, social media has given way for the spread of disinformation and misinformation, which helps to incite hate and has led to violence and the corrosion of democracy. In both Nigeria and Kenya, the youth are a significant chunk of the country's population, but as we have noticed, have less of a role in politics of their country. So what social media has done for them to provide a platform free from restrictions and consequences to voice their opinions about matters in their countries. In Kenya, for example, social media has been widely embraced by the youth to organize protest movements such as the Occupy Parliament movement, which heavily relied on social media to mobilize protesters. And this has been the same for Nigeria too, with the Not Too Young to Run campaign. Social media was used as a tool for mobilization, protest, and discussion amongst the country's population, especially the youth. In many instances, social media has empowered and encouraged grassroots youth political engagement without the control of the elderly political powers. On social media, freedom of speech is more of a reality, and this has allowed the youth to express themselves and engage in meaningful political discourse. So now the youth are more positively involved in politics, unlike before where they were used to sow discord and incite violence. This has been the case particularly in Nigeria. In many instances, youth vigilante groups were politicized and hired to support or carry out political agendas. Now the role of youth has shifted towards social agents for change. Those involved in politics in both countries have started to see the necessity of social media, and because the major users of social media are youth, have also started to positively engage the youth. In both countries, political parties and government organizations, candidates, media, civic societies have all increased their social media presence to better communicate with their populations online. And as we found that the excessive use of social media plays an important role in ensuring protection of democratic processes like free and fair election. This suggests that the extent to which social media offers participatory democracy, promoting transparency and engagement of citizens, helps to an overall speedy release of election results. On the other hand, the youth have also realized their power in the numbers they have and their voices and becoming more involved in national politics. They use the social media platforms to voice their grievances and demand accountability from their leaders. So the citizens now have a platform to report political happenings and election-related incidents in real time, from pictures and videos to text and messages. Lots of youth organizations with an online presence in both countries have conducted peaceful campaigns in various forms such as peace promotion, popular participation, and political education, even polling administration. So some of the youth organizations that we discovered were YAGA Africa, the Youth Alliance on Constitutional Electoral Reform, the Kenyan Young Parliamentarians Association, and the Commonwealth Youth Council. They've all campaigned for better electoral processes and political inclusion of their country's youth. But less positively, we have noticed that the online political participation and engagement has not translated to physical votes at the polls, and has also not increased youth participation in daily runnings of the country, so this is through political positions. And we've noticed that it was more so in Nigeria than Kenya. And this has been attributed from our surveys. We realized that it was attributed to fundamental issues in the countries, from culture surrounding age, the lack of trust in central government, electoral violence, fraud, misinformation, political instability, a range of things, religious and ethnic division, and a lack of transparency, corruption too. And so this has really helped to alienate the youthful population. And some other deterrents too, again, are the poorly run elections and the fact that the electoral processes and voting system in Nigeria and Kenya are not as technologically advanced, and it's almost become a burden to vote. And with election fraud rendering votes useless, a number of young people find it difficult to partake in political and electoral processes. We also found that factors such as high employment rates and poverty have been capitalized on by politicians to spread misinformation online during electoral processes, and they use the youth to do this. So social media is somewhat influential in the country's electoral processes, but it's not being effectively used by the government, we've come to realize. And this is also an issue because the majority of the general population are not online due to poor internet infrastructure, and then they lack an access to this service. But all in all, social media seems to have given a voice to the formerly voiceless youth in both countries, and has allowed for some change in regards to the country's politics. Without the government properly harnessing social media and technology, they stand a chance of alienating the youthful population and reducing the presence in the country's political processes. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. That's really fascinating, and I think raises a couple of the same issues in terms of basic obstacles to participation. Whether, as you mentioned, it's because they don't have access to either devices or are not connected to the internet, or for other reasons. First round of exchanges, want to just check with any of our panelists whether they have any questions for each other after those first observations.
And my question is for Emma, who is a young MP. What are the challenges you face as a young MP currently holding office? Yeah, it'll be great to hear from you.
Okay, thank you so much, Samson. Well, to be quite honest, I was appointed in March this year, and it was quite difficult to adjust to sort of the new normal with COVID-19. So I'm not really sure how being a normal MP in the normal scheme of things before COVID-19 was. But currently now, with being an MP in a time of COVID, our sessions really were tricky in holding them. So much of the emotions that I wanted to bring on the floor really had to take a back seat to prioritizing emergency issues addressing COVID-19 at the moment. But as you know, COVID-19 came to sort of disrupt as things were happening, but issues affecting young people continued to affect young people, and even worse off now with COVID-19. So really it has taken a setback for me to address student issues in Parliament, especially around student funding, issues around young entrepreneurs and getting funding for their innovative projects, young women issues around reproductive health rights and so on. So there's been quite a challenge around there. But also, I think also I'm someone who would rather consult and rather whatever I bring to the floor, I would rather have inputs from young people, the demographics and the communities I've always worked with and engaged with. That has been a limiting factor. So I've resorted, of course, to virtually connecting with various people and going out and actually seeking their opinions and thoughts on issues. But it's not the same with actually COVID being around, because if COVID wasn't around, it would be so much easier to congregate young people to be able to address and discuss issues before they get onto the parliament floor, especially young people in the rural areas who might not have access to ICTs, which do in my country pose as a challenge still today.
Excellent, thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Did you have a question as well? Sorry, Emma, I thought I saw you raise your hand
I
as
didn't.
well. No, okay, all right. Well, in that case, I'm afraid I'm going to come back to this point you were talking about around the impact of COVID, but specifically this question around disinformation, because it is something that young people in some places are accused of being quite bad at. It's also something that we've heard anecdotally is something that young people are actually quite good at spotting and weeding out. In terms of the lessons that you've learned from COVID, do you see disinformation as being a particular threat in terms of perhaps leading young people to be a bit disillusioned and not wanting to get involved in political processes?
I think a little bit. The trends that we saw as a ministry, because we decided to come up with a communication center addressing COVID-19 related issues, particularly because of misinformation and disinformation. And this is really because although young people some might be good at spotting out fake news, others not so much. And in fact, they become very instrumental in passing on disinformation, misinformation. And at some point, and especially with COVID-19 lessons, the misinformation and disinformation was almost too much to bear. It was information overload. It was information continuously and consistently being shared that wasn't truthful, and a mixture of some truthfulness and untruthfulness that brought a lot of just confusion. And at some point, I do believe many young people decided to simply just not care about whether or not they want to confirm information or not, whether that information is authentic or not. So So for me, that is worrisome, because as a country we are headed towards elections. Last year we had our presidential and national assembly elections, but now we're facing our local authority and regional elections, and these elections are really about grassroots level and service delivery at grassroots level. And these elections already traditionally do not get the proper information and proper attendance they should. But in this particular time, especially with misinformation and disinformation going around, that young people might actually be disillusioned and cut themselves off completely from this type of process, because in the scheme of things and the impact of COVID-19, I think it's making that particular reality for young people very difficult.
Thanks. I just want to check maybe with Victoria if the sort of the findings in the data that you've come across thus far also highlights disinformation maybe as a particular concern and challenge, or is it something that young people are not sort of that worried about?
Well, in Nigeria and Kenya, I've seen that they're not too worried about disinformation right now, especially because it doesn't seem as much of an issue in the both countries. From the interviews and surveys we've done, we heard more about electoral violence and rigging and malpractice and ethnic and religious issues over disinformation from both countries. So, and it's seen as more of a thing for the older generation to take part in than the younger generation.
Well, that actually leads me quite nicely to at least one final question I'd like to put to Samson, to come back to this point of, intergenerational transfer of leadership. How do you get political parties and political institutions that are not necessarily at the moment reactive and particularly enthusiastic about turning over a lot of responsibility and power to the next generation? How do you get them to be better at meeting young people in these sort of online spaces? How do you get them to be as sustained about it as, young people themselves?
So first things first, we need to make political parties understand and appreciate the cost of exclusion. And that is where it begins, because most political parties don't understand the cost of exclusion. And it's both political and economic exclusion. And so it's at the heart of this. And what I mean is that we need to get political parties and expose them to what they lose and how they undermine the development of a nation without effectively including young people as well as young persons with disability and young women. The second point is to also make political parties understand that no political party drives a development agenda without, inclusion. And so as we have that conversation is to, one, reduce the cost of politics. And so that's one way to open up the space. Because even though young people are economically, empowered, a lot of them don't have, the resources to run, to cover the cost of campaigns. So political parties should reduce, the cost of campaigns or cost of seeking nomination. The second point is political parties need to invest in leadership development. In addition to, the role that parties play as aggregating social interest or providing platforms for running for office, they are also a platform for leadership development. And so parties should have effective youth wings and women wings, that are platforms for building leadership capital in young people, and not use those platforms to mobilize and recruit young people as thugs for elections. And the third point is parties need to integrate this into their internal documents, whether constitution or policies or guidelines. It needs to be enshrined therein, things like electoral quotas, and that creates access for inclusion of young people in lists submitted by political parties for elections or for women. I think these temporary measures can increase, the level of youth participation, in the electoral process. But I can't end by saying that if political parties remain as an assemblage of the old boys, or if they remain an old boys club, it will be very, very difficult for them to make progress over a long period of time. That is why we need to ensure that women and young people and persons with disabilities are integrated not just as members, but as leaders of political parties as well as candidates at elections.
Thanks, Samson. And hopefully Emma and many like her are evidence that these old boys clubs are slowly being eroded. I'm afraid we're not going to have time for much else there today, but I'd like to just take 2 minutes just to thank you all and wrap up. But there was a lot of interesting ideas, suggestions there about how we can do more in this space, which certainly I look forward to discussing with both our colleagues here at the Foundation and with the IPU, and with yourselves. I think hopefully this will be the first in a series of conversations. I'd like to thank you all for joining. Thank you to IPU and our co-hosts, and as well to the organisers of Geneva Peace Week. I think there's huge and exciting potential for future collaboration in support of young political leaders, just like you and like, I think, hundreds of thousands of others in the world. So I think from the Foundation point of view and IPU's point of view, we'd sort of say, watch this space. And in the meantime, thank you all very, very, very much, and enjoy the rest of Peace Week.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.